Welcome, everyone. Good to see all of you here. We are here for the dissertation defense of Elias Snyder. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist. I'm former core faculty in East-West psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and I have the honor to be the chair of this dissertation committee. At this time, I'd like to ask the committee to introduce itself, I think starting with our second reader and then our external reader.
Oh, is that I'm the second reader? I didn't know what I was. There you have it. I'm confused. Good morning, everyone. I'm Kimmy Johnson, and I am honored to be part of this process with Elias. It's just been, it's a beautiful experience to work with this young man. Thanks a lot. I'm glad you all are here.
And Carol?
Hello, everyone. Greetings. I am so very, very honored to be a part of this committee. I fondly call Elias Brad sometimes, and then I'll say Elias, because I met him as Brad, and I am a spiritual care provider for Kaiser Permanente in California. It's the greater Southern California area, and that's where he and I met, and I'll tell a very, very brief intro. I was off on leave when Elias, then Brad, was hired, and I was like, who's this guy? Who'd they hire without me being a part of it? And when I came back, the first day I came back to work from my leave, Brad Elias came into my office, and it was on like popcorn. And he's been my, we've enfolded ourselves. I think we're kindred spirits from yesterday into today. And so it's just a pleasure to be a part of this and to know him. So, all right, Craig.
All right, thanks so much, Carol. So the title of the dissertation, just so you all know it, is Attending to Soul's Wounds at the End of Life, Neurodecolonizing Practices and Perspectives for Palliative and End-of-Life Care. So let me give you just a brief look at what we'll do, and then we'll hand it over to Elias. So he'll go and give us about 30 minutes presenting his work, telling us what it was about, methodologies he used, what he found, things like that. And once he's done presenting, the committee will have a chance to ask him, each of us, one or two questions about his presentation. And when we're done, we will go into a separate room to confer, and that will give all of you a chance to ask him further questions at that time. When the committee is done conferring, we'll come back into this room, and then I'll make an announcement. So that's what we will do. And with that, Elias, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks, Craig. We're probably going to have some IT snafus, heads up, but we'll see how this goes. First one is now. Okay, there we go. Can you all see that in the Zoom land?
No. Are you sharing a?
Oh, hold on.
PowerPoint?
See, I told you there would be. Where's this over? Now.
All right, we can see your presentation.
Okay, great. That's gonna keep happening, so just roll with it. Okay. Thank you all for being here. I'm so grateful to have you all here. I'm facing this way because that's the microphone, so that's why this is a little awkward for the people in person. But I just want to say, yeah, this has really been a labor of love. And I want to also say I'm really showing up fully authentically today. So you've already been hearing the names going around: Bradley, Brad, Elias, Eli. Yeah, so I'm just showing up, feeling like I want to, showing up as my full self today. This research has really expanded my heart, and I'm really honored to share this with you. So I want to start also, I want to acknowledge the indigenous people of these lands, the Piscataway Conoy community. I want to acknowledge the unseen labor that has gone into building this country, this city, largely on the back of enslaved folks of African heritage. And I want to just say that we see you and thank you. And yeah, it's important to remember where we come from and all the parts that connect us. So you'll notice during this presentation that I'm kind of dancing between worlds. So what I mean by that is I'm blending Euro-Western science, which is science that we typically think of the scientific method, objectivity, data, that sort of science. I'm blending that with indigenous science, which talks a lot about interconnection and multiple ways of knowing. And it has a place for the soul and spirit as well. So I'm blending these together. And today is my goal. My goal today is to share with you what I've learned along the way. And I also mentioned briefly, obviously I value academia. I've been in academia for 11 years. I have all the student loans to prove it, all of this stuff. But I don't want to sound like an academic today. I really want to explain this stuff in concepts so that everybody understands. So yeah, the goal here is to really tell the stories that need to be told. So attending to soul wounds at the end of life. Let's dive in here. Oh, I told you I teach. Okay. So we're going to start with a brief meditation. If you want to close your eyes, get comfortable in your seat. We've all come from wherever we're coming from, so just kind of get comfortable if you'd like. And just maybe taking a few deep breaths, maybe feeling your feet on the floor, kind of slowing down your heart rate, just kind of being present in this moment. And I invite you to call to mind something about yourself that you really value, something that you really love, a characteristic, a trait, something about yourself that you really appreciate. And just sit with that for a moment. And then I invite you, without thinking too hard, maybe this is more an intuitive process or a felt sense, call to mind an ancestor who also shares that trait with you, or that characteristic. Just see who arrives in your mind. And maybe noticing what that feels like to share this trait or this connection with this ancestor, this person that you share so much with. Maybe taking a few deep breaths, acknowledging their presence. And if you would like, you can invite them to stay. You can say thank you, be on your way, whatever feels good to you. And then you can slowly start to open your eyes and come back into space together. All of our ancestors here present. And Jonathan, if you can spotlight now the altar.
I can, Brad, or Elias, can you unshare your presentation and then the altar will come up full screen for people?
Yes. Oh yeah. Oh, shit. How about that?
Perfect. And I'll spotlight this. Here we go.
I wanted to call my ancestors and to be with us today. Can you see the Zoom screen again?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. So for the last 10 years, I've been working in hospice and palliative care. So I'm a board certified hospice and palliative care nurse practitioner, and I've had the privilege of working in this space around the world. And truly being with people at the end of life, being with them as they take their last breath, has been the greatest honor of my life. And I really wanted to understand what is causing suffering for these people that are in my care, that entrust me with their care, and how can we ease this? So that's what kind of led me to this journey. So today, the flow, I'm going to talk about the research methodologies I used. I'm going to introduce a new theory that I developed. I'm going to share with you some stories from elders and healers and wisdom keepers around the world, and then share the themes that came from those conversations. I'll talk about some of the limitations of the research and then the path forward. So I used a methodology that's probably not familiar to many people, indigenous mixed methods research. So this is a philosophical approach to research. And what it's rooted in is the 4 R's. So it's rooted in responsibility, respect, reciprocity, and rights of the research. The reason I wanted to use this is because it utilizes what's called 2-eyed seeing. So it allows us to blend Euro-Western research that I explained in the beginning with indigenous research methodologies. So when we think of mixed methods, typically we think about qualitative and quantitative or data and stories, but this is really blending indigenous philosophies with Euro-Western research. I appreciate this because I see myself as somebody that kind of dances between worlds, and this allows to blend yin and yang, data and soul, and it puts kind of evidence-based literature on equal footing with indigenous knowledge and wisdom. So that's why I'm utilizing this today. And it also critically analyzes and assesses Euro-Western research because it's not always done appropriately or responsibly. And as a non-Indigenous person, I wasn't sure if I could use this methodology. I didn't know if it was something that's just for Indigenous folks. So I actually had the opportunity to speak with 3 Indigenous scholars, and they all felt that it was appropriate for me to use this. So I just wanted to name that. That was a really important part of my journey here. So a little bit of the study design, I did 2 parts. One is theoretical. I pulled all these different concepts together to develop this new theory called attending to soul wounds at the end of life. And I'll explain this to you. And then the second part is qualitative, so more story-based. And I did a few things. I did an analysis to see what do people need at the end of life from our typical kind of Euro-Western palliative care lens. And then I interviewed elders and healers and wisdom keepers from 10 cultures and traditions around the world to understand how they care for people at the end of life. You'll hear me referring to these people as co-researchers, not because we wrote the research together, but because we were a part of the story and learning together. I took those 2 things and I put them together. So I put the Euro-Western into conversation with the Indigenous because I really wanted to see how these things can work together. And then finally, I took the themes from just the co-researchers, those elders, healers, and wisdom keepers, and looked for similarities and differences between their stories. So I'm going to share all this with you today. But the first things first, this is hot off the press. You're the first ones to hear about the new theory. It's actually not in press yet. It's being edited, the dissertation. But here's the new theory. I'm going to explain it to you very simply so you get it, hopefully. At the end of life, we know that suffering is a big problem for people. It's a big problem. I wanted to know what's causing some of this suffering. One of the causes of suffering at the end of life is the trauma that's been passed down in our family life. So if our family member has experienced trauma, there's research to show that we're actually impacted by that. And if it's not healed, then that's impacting us at the end of our lives. The way forward, the way to heal this trauma is by reconnecting to the beneficial healing traditions of our ancestors, of our people. And I'm going to share more of that with you. But as a brief example, let's say your grandparent experienced some traumatic event, a war, family abuse, alcoholism, whatever the traumatic event is. They didn't heal it. That trauma gets passed down and impacts us psychologically and biologically as well. So that's sort of what this theory is saying. I'll break it down a little bit more. So when I talk about suffering, I'm talking about existential suffering. There's no good definition for this, but you can think of it as non-physical suffering. So I'm not talking pain or nausea, but I'm talking things related to loss, fear, worry, things like loss of meaning, fear of death and dying, hopelessness. These are sort of the components that make up existential suffering, and that's the suffering I'm talking about today. This is a big issue at the end of life. Some people refer to it as unbearable suffering because it's so intense. It leads to poor quality of life, increased anxiety and depression, suicidal thoughts, and some people say they want to die sooner because it's so unbearable, this existential suffering. It's also a neglected symptom of suffering because there's not a lot of research in it, so we as clinicians aren't trained in it. We don't really understand it, and therefore we don't know how to help people through it. So that's part of why I wanted to do this research. When I talked about intergenerational trauma, so the trauma that gets passed down through the family lines, again, if your parent, grandparent, your ancestors experience a traumatic event, research shows, which I'll explain in a minute, that it does actually get passed down to us. And because about 70% of the world has experienced a traumatic event, that means the vast majority of us are holding this trauma in our bodies. The theory is called attending to soul wounds at the end of life. So soul wounds is the term that I use to explain intergenerational trauma. It's an indigenous term. And the reason I like it is because they say that the trauma is so intense that it actually affects our spirit and soul. So Eduardo Duran is the author of Healing the Soul Wound. He's an indigenous psychologist that I had the privilege of speaking with. And that's why I'm using this term for this work, because it's so intense that it actually impacts. Studies in the field of epigenetics can help to explain this. There's been a surge of research over the last decade that explains how traumatic experiences impact us. One example with rats. This one just kind of blows my mind. This was done in 2014. They had a female rat and they gave her a really harsh smell, and at the same time, they gave her a shock, something that startled her. She had her little baby rats. And then the baby rats, when they smelled that same smell, they had a change in their behavior, even though they weren't exposed to the startle response. And not only did they have a change in behavior, but the actual part of their brain that processes that smell was changed. And this impacted 2 generations after the mom rat. On a human level, you can think about 2 examples are mothers who survived the Holocaust, people who were pregnant during 9/11, mothers who were diagnosed with PTSD for various reasons of trauma. Their kids actually had low cortisol levels, which is the stress hormone. So they had a biochemical change in their body. They did not produce the same amount of cortisol because their mothers had experienced this traumatic event. So the trauma actually impacts us on a physiologic level. And studies show that this impacts 2 generations or even 6 decades after the fact. And in indigenous science, it actually says that it impacts 7 generations. The path forward, as I mentioned, was about reconnecting to our ancestral traditions. So the theory of neurodecolonization, when I found this, my mind kind of exploded. Neurodecolonization, like neurological decolonization, it was developed by Dr. Michael Yellowbird. He's an indigenous social worker, professor, activist. He originally developed this theory to support indigenous communities to overcome their impacts of colonization. And what he found is that by reconnecting to the beneficial healing traditions of our ancestors, that you can actually restore health and well-being in your body. I had the privilege of speaking with him. He very graciously spoke to me. And I said, could we expand this to include people that don't identify as indigenous? Could this theory be for everyone? Because so many of us have been torn away from our traditional practices. And he said yes. He gave me his blessing to expand on his research and also to use it with people at the end of life. So I'm going to share a little bit of some studies in neuroscience to help explain this idea. What they've found over time, neurobiological studies, is that the top picture, these regions of the brain are always implicated when people are doing mindfulness or meditative practices. We actually see structural changes in the brain in these regions when people are doing mindfulness and meditative practices. Then the bottom picture shows these neural networks that fire when people are doing these mindful meditation practices. So what you get is actual structural changes in your brain and functional changes in your brain when people do meditative practices. Most of our ancestors, most of their traditions are rooted in meditative or mindfulness practices. So when we do those, this sort of beneficial changes in the brain can begin to happen. We also know that our ancestors did not just sit and meditate, but they drummed and they danced and they had music. So neuroimaging studies show that when people are drumming, they actually have improved cognition, memory, movement, and emotions. So because drumming is a part of all of our cultures, it's common for all of us throughout history. When we drum and we reconnect to music, it's very beneficial for us on a neurological level. I talked about the fact that so many of us have forgotten our traditional ways. This can be a little bit of a challenge. How do you do neurodecolonization if you don't remember your traditional practices? What I want to kind of stress here, this is really important, is that every one of us comes from a people who were at one time indigenous to a place. And some of us still know what that place is and have that indigenous connection. But all of our ancestors, they had rituals and traditions that were designed for us, for healing. Over time, throughout history, we've become removed from those for various reasons. I'll give two brief examples. One, during the Christian Crusades and during the Muslim conquest throughout Europe and the Arab world, people were torn away from their indigenous practices very violently and imposed with Christianity and Islam. Then European colonization took place in the 15th century, and Europeans went all over the world tearing people from their indigenous practices. These are examples of why most of us, and research shows that about 98% of the world has been colonized at this point. So why the vast majority of us throughout the world on this earth have been removed from our indigenous practice. Let me show you a graph, because that was a lot of info. So let me just bring it home with one image. We have soul wounds in us from our ancestors that have been passed down through epigenetics. We also have forgotten our ancestral healing traditions because they have been erased or diluted or forgotten throughout history. These two things cause this existential suffering at the end of life. The solution is that we need to reclaim and practice our ancestral healing traditions, start the process of neurodecolonization, and then this leads to less suffering and a good death for people. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. I've been so in this research, I am like, what am I even talking about? Is this making sense to people? So that's good. The next part of the research, so that's the first part, the theoretical part. The next part of the research, the hope is that these stories that I'm going to share with you can offer ways to reconnect, help you reconnect to the beneficial traditions of your ancestors. So I started looking at what do people need at the end of life from a Euro-Western perspective. So I did a big analysis of all of the literature, and I found these are the 10 things that we talk about in our Euro-Western palliative care hospice practice that people need at the end of life. Not once was intergenerational trauma or soul wounds mentioned. But what we find here is these 10 things, but I knew this wasn't the whole story. I knew this isn't the only way to support people at the end of life. So that's why I went out and I talked to people all over the world about their end of life practices. And I want to bring their stories into this conversation for a moment. And this is going to be another second. Okay, here we go. So these are the people that I spoke to. Elders, healers, and wisdom keepers from various traditions all over the world. And I'm going to share with you a brief video that just shares some of what they told me about how they care for people at the end of life and some of the traditions and practices in their tradition. So go here. Thank you.
That next tab right over.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay, okay, okay. Hold on, y'all. Calling my edges. Can the Zoom people see that? Can the Zoom people see this?
Yes.
And in Hindu philosophy, if you're chanting the name of God at the time of transition, it's the ultimate karmic blessing. And, you know, Gandhi said, "Oh, Ram, Ram," as he was dying, you know, after he got shot. And it was just like really considered powerful. So if you can't chant it or say it, so if somebody can be chanting to you while you're releasing, what a powerful karmic blessing.
When somebody is very sick and you think he or she might die, so traditionally they speak to ancestors, and as a sign of talking to them, they will make like a charm, and then this will be tied around your your arm. And according to him, if the ancestors have not called you, or if they're not willing that you're gonna die, even if it's somebody who did something bad to you, they want to kill you, if the ancestors have not allowed that, with that charm around your arm, it will prevent it.
That to become free, we also need to give up our concept of freedom and our attachment to it. In any meaningful connection, there is rebirth.
There's also a belief system through Ayana, which is like the Holy Spirit, or the Spirit, you can call it in a Western way of thinking. We all have Ayana, and through that we are connected. Even the plants, the animal, the entire cosmos is connected and held through Ayana. So there's a connection of everything is connected, and also no one kind of goes out of this cosmos even when you die.
And just become a witness to everything, to your body's sensations, and even to your thoughts and to your feelings, you know. And so by doing that, you become, you know, you realize that you are not the body. And then when you start witnessing your feelings, you realize you're not the feeling. You start witnessing your thoughts, then you realize, oh, you're not the mind, because you can see the thoughts in front of you. So you must be somebody else other than the mind. And then if you continue this process, then you arrive at yourself, at your true self, and there you are, you're home. You're enlightened. Nirvana, that's nirvana.
And I keep hearing in my mind that, look, the Plains elder telling us when I was a student, your ancestors have been waiting a long time to hear their names. And when he said that, I cried. I remember crying. I mean, just tears came into my eyes, because it was, you know, I see these students, these wonderful students of mine, just looking everywhere, you know, on this mountaintop or there, but completely turning their backs on their own ancestors. And I think they could take them with them. Their ancestors probably would like to do ayahuasca in Peru. I don't know, but I mean, I think, you know, they need to, I think we need to acknowledge that we are a continuation of something.
Oh, so he's starting praying for him.
So I'll explain what's happening here.
Closing.
He has a rope, and he's tying, like putting a blessing into the rope.
And he put
And then they use
so
a
he takes
mixture of milk and water,
the
calabash.
take the water
It blesses it,
and milk.
and then pause for the dramatic effect.
And give him.
And then you welcome to our puppy.
This. You give another one.
You pass it around and everybody ties and blesses them.
The idea with the drum is that all of the elements that make up the construction of the drum are reflective of the world in which human beings live.
Okay.
So the hide, right? The wood, sometimes on frames people will hang feathers.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're playing in an English sense, right, is your relationship to the world in which you're a part of.
Quetzalcoatl will come with the fire. Quetzalcoatl is the serpent, but the forehead is the fire that comes down into the earth to give life. So if you find your fire within you, then you will find peace. And when you find peace, you will just go into whatever task is ahead of you with greatness, gracefully, or with grace. And you know, everybody is different because we are in different moments in our lives. We experience things differently. And in community, holding hands, you know, hold somebody's hands. Don't be alone in any of this process, whatever process it is. Don't be alone. Don't be alone. Don't be alone.
Walk with me, Lord. Walk with me in my trials. Walk with me while I'm on this pilgrim journey. Lord, I want Jesus to walk with me. So if you take those names out and you say, Lord, or Mama, or Daddy, or whomever, I want you to walk with me. Walk with me on this journey to the other side. That's when I'm talking about invoking the spirit and calling upon the ancestors.
So for the stories, snippets of the stories. Here they are again. Coming in. Okay. So I want to tell you a little bit of the analysis that I did. So as I mentioned, I looked for the top 10 things from a Euro-Western lens that people need at the end of life. What do we need to do to support people? For example, we often talk about finding or making meaning of life or coming to peace with what we view as the sacred. These are things that we often talk about in hospice and palliative care. What I did was I put them in conversation with the information that I gathered from these co-researchers. So for example, Thomas Bayou, he talked about the first line says finding and making meaning of life. That's from the Euro-Western research. We know that's something we need to do. Thomas said, when we die, our body feeds the soil feeds our bodies and souls. So that's a way you could think about, okay, when I die, I actually could have meaning in my life because I then contribute to the soil, which then contributes to bodies. He also says at the end of life, you can break, or at any time really, you can break the cycles of trauma for yourself, past and future generations. That's another way you could make meaning of your life. Coming to peace with the sacred is part of the Euro-Western framework, but he says from his positionality, where he stands, beyond belief, you can know that the divine is there. If you look at the sky and the rain, the divine sent those things. So that's an easy way to come to peace with the sacred. And also the divine is within us and around us. So those are easy ways from his lens that you can connect. So I did this for each of the co-researchers. And if you go to the 200-page dissertation discussion section, you can read all of them right there. But I also found that there were things that didn't fit into the Euro-Western framework, and it wasn't my intention to make things fit. So some of this doesn't necessarily fit into that framework, like he says, recognizing that pain and trauma are a result of our collective experience. So often people feel like, I have all this trauma, I have all of this heaviness, but he said, take the I out because we're actually so interconnected that it's our collective experience. He said, we're experiencing that we are all connected in one cosmos. He talked about the web of Ayana. That's another way that he can help people at the end of life. And from the Ethiopian tradition, unquestionably knowing that the community will be there to support your loved ones after you've died can really help people to find peace. So then, I just looked at the conversations with elders, healers, and wisdom keepers, and I did a thematic analysis. So for all of them, all of these traditions, all of them, there were these common themes that appeared. And I'm going to share them with you. The first one is that death is sacred. It is not a medical event. It's a natural part of living. In the US, about 70% of Americans say they want to die at home, but only 30% of them do. So most people die in a hospital even though they don't want to. This is the opposite of what these people are saying, that death is a sacred event. It's a natural part of living. We need guides at the end of life. People need guides, loved ones, elders, trained clinicians, spiritual practitioners. We need people to help walk us through this. So don't do this chapter of life alone. People need to have the freedom to die on their terms. So there are rituals and there are traditions, but it's also important to give people permission. As Carol Estes says, give people permission to ride the ride however they want it. And that's our job, to support them, to give people the freedom to do this. So we need to kind of let go of the rigid ideas about how the end-of-life process should be and be open to how people want to experience it. Fear is also very common, and for everybody involved, loved ones, caregivers, clinicians, people at the end of life, we all can have this fear. But the hope is that by using these different rituals, so Mr. Organist talked about the sacred Ifundo charm in the Pare tradition in Tanzania, that can help bring people peace. In Hindu philosophy, if you give someone a tulsi leaf with water from the Ganga River, these are things that you can do to help ease fear for people. So all of these traditions should be utilized at this time to help ease fear. We have a responsibility to heal suffering. And this can be from trauma. It can be trauma from a grandparent. It can be about guilt about how maybe you treated your child. It could be any number of things that are causing this sort of suffering at the end of life. And it's our responsibility as people, as supporters of people in the last chapter of life, to help heal this suffering. We also live on. And this was a very common theme that all of the people spoke about. That part of us lives on after we die, and therefore the ancestors are with us. The only exception to this was the Maasai tribe. They believe that when you die, that's it, that's the end, you just die. But all other traditions really had this deeply held, not even a belief, but a knowing that the ancestors live with us. The ancestors are here to support us and guide us, and it's our job, this is our job, to bridge the connection. So Aditi Sethi uses traditional music to connect with her ancestors. Chagwa lights a candle to illuminate the way for her ancestors. Mr. Organist opens the connection by pouring their ancestors' favorite drink, or the local denguru, which is like a local alcohol, onto the ground. And these are ways that people open that portal, that connection. There were also things that were not common across all of the conversations that I wanted to highlight, things that kind of stuck out. I call these unexpected themes. I really liked these because, again, having done this work for a decade, I love that I'm still surprised. I love that there's still more for me to learn. Chagwa says, when you're in community, the pain is less because you share the same sorrow. We need each other at the end of life. And this is in contrast to the Euro-Western idea of the individualism. Like, I can do this, let me rise up, pull myself up by the bootstraps. It's the opposite. People are saying, no, this is not the time to be alone. We got you. Let's do this together. They also, some traditions, they want kids to be there to learn. The Maasai tradition, they don't let kids, only elders. But either way, having people with you at the end of life can really help inspire us to live as well as possible. When I talk to people about death, inevitably they talk about birth. And instead of seeing these as opposites, it can be helpful to see them as cycles, each affecting each other. So there's no dying without living, there's no death without birth. People talk about birth process and midwifery and doulas as we talked about the end of life. And as Musha Mikeda said, if you remember, in any meaningful connection, there is a birth. Interconnection was another big theme. Interconnection with others, the universe, the web of Ayana in Ethiopian tradition. There's the network of ancestors in the Pare tribe. There is the drum, and when we play the drum, it's reminding us of our interconnection with the world, as John Carlos Pereira said. And then this also ties into those studies of epigenetics that says we're so impacted by our ancestors, that line. So I love this idea of interconnection. This kept coming up, this idea that we're a continuation of something. It's important to let go and release resentment, guilt, fear. All of this is important to release so that we can be mentally free. In Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, they particularly stress the importance of this so that you can kind of go to the next chapter of life with more ease. And then on a very practical level of releasing, Carol Estes spoke of the need or the importance of like wailing, just to like move stuff out of your body, move through the grief and move that blocked energy. All of our traditions from all of our ancestors has tools. There are specific mantras to support people at the end of life. The sacred Ifundo charm in the Pare tradition, calabash and stones for the Maasai can predict problems and identify solutions. Fire lights the way for the ancestors to come, and Quetzalcoatl from a Mesoamerican tradition. Powwows and flutes and drums facilitate collective prayer in a lot of indigenous Native American communities. And in the Ethiopian tradition, the sycamore tree is a place of refuge where people can commune with the divine. So there's tons of tools. All of our traditions have tools and sacred objects that are sources of healing. And finally, this one I really liked, it surprised me. The idea of borrowing to remember. So I emphasize in this work a lot, like specificity, like your ancestral traditions, find your line. A lot of these elders and healers that I spoke with, they said, yes, that's important, but with respect and reciprocity and ideally permission, it's okay to borrow other traditions to help you remember your own. So for example, when I'd meditate, I would also often light sage or Palo Santo to kind of cleanse the space. Through that, as I was on this journey, I learned that in Syrian culture, there's an herb called Syrian rue that is also used to cleanse the space and used for meditation and prayer. So now I use that, but the Palo Santo and the sage kind of helped me get there. Okay. Those are those things. That was a lot. I'm cruising, folks. I got 200 pages to talk about in this short time. So let me end with this. I'm just going to kind of bring this home here. I think this slide is in the wrong position. But I will just tell you what is very important. This is my grandmother, who's 95. Hello, Mom. If you can hear, she's here. We need to start this work now. We don't need to wait. Don't wait until it's too late. Don't wait until the very end. Get started now before it's too late. As I was speaking to people, I started thinking, perhaps there are many paths that lead us to different destinations. Many paths, many destinations. Or maybe there are many paths that lead us to one destination, like many rivers leading to the ocean. I don't know the answer. I don't know. But what I do know is that because we are a continuation of something, we carry the stories of our families within us, the traumas, the joy, the shadows, the light. And the call here is for us to identify what needs healing within our. So that's really the takeaway message here. Like, what needs healing within our family lines before we get to the end of life? And then we can reclaim these pieces of ourselves that have been forgotten. We can reclaim these traditions and use those things to start healing, deep healing of our souls, so that we can hopefully end suffering, break the cycles of trauma, and have a good death. That's really the idea. And I think that's pretty much what I have to say here. One second. I'm sorry. There was a chunk that was missing. Whatever, IT. Let me just say quickly, and then I'll end on a nice note. A couple of the limitations of the study. So one is that COVID happened. So I was originally going to travel around the world and meet people and talk to them, but it ended up having to be on Zoom and all this stuff happened. So COVID happened. The other part that I really wanted was when I was doing these analyses with people, I wanted to do it together with them. But because of funding and time, I wasn't able to do that. So what I did was I wrote up a summary of the conversations, I did an analysis, and I sent it back to them for verification. So they were able to change everything so that people really feel very good about what is being said. I'm not saying anything that they don't feel proud of. 3 of the people I wasn't able to do verifications for because of geography and I couldn't get in touch with them. Mr. Orjanis in the Pare tribe, he was very rurally in Tanzania, it was very hard to get in touch with him. Krishnakant Shukla in Varanasi, India, I couldn't get back in touch with him. And then I think it's also really important to mention the Maasai tribe. When I went back, I was actually going back to see them in person. You remember this? There was tons of Maasai coming out in trucks. We were like, what is going on? What is going on? The government was displacing them. So they were moving them from their homelands in the Ngorongoro conservation area in Tanzania and relocating them to different places all over the country. So it's a really big human rights violation that was happening as we were going back. So I wasn't able to do the So I think the big also takeaway here is that for palliative care clinicians, just put this stuff in your toolbox, put this in your medicine bag, keep this in the back of your mind as things to talk about with people, talk to them about what calls for healing in their family, talk about their ancestral traditions. And then for us as non-hospice palliative care people, you can also do the same thing. Sit around and really think what calls for healing in your family line. And we can start to break those cycles of trauma and reconnect our ancestral practices. And I'll end with this. Because these traumas run so deep, they hit our souls, they hit our spirits. I really have found the medicine for this does not lie in pills. It does not lie in pharmacies. It lies in the songs of our grandmothers, the wisdom of our ancestors. And we have this opportunity to reclaim what has been forgotten, erased, and diluted. It's our call to action. So I encourage all of you to start this process because our ancestors are waiting to hear their names. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow. What a wonderful presentation. Thank you. So it's a custom in East-West psychology to ask the external reader to go first in terms of questions. So Carol, do you have a question for Elias?
I have lots of questions, but it's really hard to encapsulate it in such a short period of time. But they're not questions about the what and the what. It's just questions about how this work has expanded and shifted and more grown. But before I say that, I want to say this, Craig, and I want to say and send a shout out, a really huge shout out to Mrs. Gladys. Mrs. Gladys, you are a wonderful, marvelous lady who I have yet to meet, but I know you through your grandson. When we talk about ancestors and elders, in the generations that come after them. You can feel the spirit, and I definitely feel your spirit. He is such a kind, wonderful, loving, intelligent, spirit-filled person. And I know that comes from you because you poured it into his dad and his mom. Hey, mom, I know Gladys is not your mother, but I'm giving you a shout out too, because half and half and 3/4, but you can feel it from the root. So I just wanted to say, Grandma, blessings to you and thank you for this creation. And so that was my question at the beginning. And the reason why I like Brad, I say Brad, but I like to shorten it. In my mind, I think it's Rad, because you're radically hospitable, you're radically inclusive, you're radically intentional about how you love and how you set and create community. You're radical in the world of just engaging with and involving so many people. So I'm just so, my heart is full of joy right now for, I know the beginning of this ride and to get here. And so that was my question to just kind of bring it back home. How has this work expanded you from the spiritual sense, from the philosophical sense? And I know it has, but maybe just say just a minute about the word about that, and then I'll leave you be. But I send you much love. Thank you, my friend, for letting me be a part of this journey.
Thank you. I'm sweating and I'm blushing. You can't see it. Thank you for all that. I mean, you've been walking with me, honestly. You've been walking with me through this process. So I think we've been changing and growing together, but I love you and I see you as such a mentor. But I think to answer your question, reconnecting to my ancestral line and talking about it with my family has given me I feel more rooted, I feel more grounded and connected to something. And I feel like, I don't know if my family realizes it, but I do feel like because we've been talking about this stuff more, like there is something happening in our family. There is some little twinges of healing that's going on. There's little sparkles that are starting to shift. And I just feel like I'm watching the magic unfold before my eyes. And I think that's the biggest change that I see happening. So I really thank you for being with me, Carol, truly every step. Whether we're having margaritas, whether we're just out with our patients, we're always just we're bringing the spirit to everything we do, you know?
We're dancing in the streets in DC. Ashe.
Doing the city line, whatever we're doing. The spirit is there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carol. Kimmy, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you. Well, Elias, I think you know how much you mean to me and how much this work means to me. I watched you open your heart to the bigger story of who you are when you were claiming your Syrian ancestry years ago in my class. And I've watched you take something that was seeded, excuse me, in me by Pila Colorado, who taught at the California Institute of Ventricle Studies years ago. And I've watched you take it and grow it and root it deeply in this work. I think, I don't really have a question for you because what I'm seeing is that you're unfolding your journey in a way that serves your ancestors, that serves my ancestors, that serves all of us. So I just offer you my blessings and my gratitude for being a part of this with you.
Thank you, Kimmy. You know I love you. I mean, thank you. Kimmy is the professor that started me on the path of ancestral healing and work. And this is what her life's work is and what she teaches us. So this is my mentor. And I also really appreciate you walking with me. This was hard for me to do this dissertation because as a nurse practitioner with a master's in science, and I'm in that world, but I'm also in this world of the spirit and of the soul and of the ancestors. It's very, I feel like I'm coming out again in a way, like blending these things. And it's hard, but you were there with me the last several years, but specifically writing this dissertation, just always encouraging me, like, go forth, put the spirit first, put the ancestors first. And I really needed that, because there were times that I just thought, people are going to get this, and they're going to think I'm too woo-woo, hippy-dippy out there, but I really needed your guidance, and you were right there cheerleading me. So thank you.
Well, Elias, before I ask my question, I just wanted to say how wonderful I think your work is and how much I appreciate it. And I remember you and I having a conversation about it some years back, and you had the seed of the idea at that time. And I remember it clearly, partly because of my own reaction to what you were telling me. And there are some topics that I really like mentally and intellectually, and then others, you know, in different ways. But when you first mentioned your idea for this research, I felt it right in my heart. And it was before a lot of my own encounters with the systems that deal with the elderly among us. And, you know, I thought, wow, this is just going to be terrific. And it clearly is. I loved your presentation. I hope you modify it and spread it all over the world. I hope you write books about this, lead workshops, do all kinds of things with it. And to be specific, I wanted to mention that I love how you draw different areas of knowledge and practice together so that they can be in conversation with each other. Your sensitivity to culture, which has served you throughout the entire process, the way you meld thought and practice, and your courage for being able to bring the heart in with the head, but to value both, to listen to both sides and hear what they have to say. And of course, the way you give voice to what the elders are trying to tell us, the elders and the ancestors both. So all appreciation for all of that and much more. Now to my question. So I'm going to use my own parents as an example since they're kind of up for me over the last few years. My dad died a few years ago after being in hospice. My mother's still alive, but I can already see that she is not going to be that way all that much longer. So I imagine that hospice might be where she ends up too. Don't know yet. But the reason I'm raising this is because it seems to me, and I remember you and me talking about this a number of times, that the story dimension of this is so important. The story of where we come from and who our ancestors are and other things, our families. And so my question is this: how do you handle it as a practitioner with people who are kind of resistant to all that? My dad, when he was around, had a kind of a marginal interest in his roots, but not much. And my mom has even less. She doesn't even want to talk about that stuff. I've inherited all the family photographs at this point. So when you're working with people like that who are resistant, probably because of some traumatic dynamic within themselves, right? What are the considerations you have? How do you work with them? Could you just speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, just to give a gratitude to you for a moment. You were the first person when we were in our research methods class, when this idea started like coming to life. And I remember you saying, this is good. Keep doing this. Let's work on this. And you've been with me the last 5 years through this. And I really appreciate your support as well, because as I said to Kimmy, it's really hard sometimes to balance those things in my mind, but you were constantly there supporting me and helping me refine this. So I really appreciate you. Thank you so much. For your question, so the theory of neurodecolonization by Dr. Yellowbird, it says that somewhere, okay, let me start here. Our ancestors, their brains developed alongside these traditions. They were singing, they were doing these meditations, they were doing these practices. So their brain physically, the structure of their brain physically changed. When we have kids, part of that gets passed on to the kids. genetically through DNA, parts of our brain structure passed down. The theory of neurodecolonization says perhaps there's parts of our brain that when we can just get on the path of this ancestral remembrance, that those light up, those neural pathways light up, and maybe part of us actually does remember these practices. So for people that are kind of hesitant or maybe don't quite grasp the idea of ancestral reconnection or finding your roots, what I recommend is actually just starting really simply. So I like to talk a lot about cooking, because the food of our ancestors, it can be really interesting to just say, you can go deep into like the cultural food. So Drew and I cook a lot of Filipino and Middle Eastern food in our house, but it can also just be like the cookie recipe from your grandma or the potato salad recipe from your grandma, and start to see what happens. Because when you start somewhere, you don't know where it's going to lead. And even when you start doing this, I think food is very approachable. That's why I started with this as an example. Stories are in there. Stories can come out. You can start talking about your family, start talking about what needs healing, and the food can kind of facilitate that process. I think that's a really simple way to do it. And also music is also really simple. So if you know, even if you don't know exactly where your ancestors come from, you can kind of think there's a region in the world where these people came from, and finding the traditional music of that area. And just, even if you're sitting with your mom, like, I'm just gonna put on some music in the background, see what happens. Maybe there are some neural pathways that are lighting up and something starts to happen. So I think starting gently with like very approachable, tangible things could lead to something more deep.
Yeah, I really like that. I appreciate that response very much. It's so important to meet people where they are.
Yeah.
As my therapy teachers drummed into me when I was in training. And I like your mention of the cookbook. Recently, my mom's been throwing out a lot of stuff, and I told her I want another look at it before we take it all the way out to the trash. And so one of the things she threw out was a whole bunch of recipes in my grandmother's handwriting. And I said, "You don't want this?" And she said, "No." And I said, "Well, I do." And which puzzled her because I'm kind of an indifferent cook. But in accord with what you just said, I think that those might come in useful. So we'll have to see. I'll let you know.
Yeah, keep me posted. Keep me posted.
Yeah. So at this time, if Jonathan, if you will work your magic, the committee will meet in a different room, and this is your opportunity, everyone who's here, to engage with Elias and ask your own questions. And we'll be back in a few minutes.
Yay.
All right.
Okay, and just to confirm, Carol, you are labeled as iPhone?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, I'll send you to your room.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, nothing too hard, people. Nothing too hard. Any questions?
And I think we've lost your video,
Oh.
Elias.
Can you see it now?
Yeah, it's back now.
Is it?
Yeah, he's in the bottom left.
Oh,
well,
there you go. Thank you.
yeah.
Thanks,
Mhm.
Jamie. Yep.
Sure.
Why is Jamie up there?
All right, so I can help facilitate the flow of questions here. We have Ali raised your hand there. Otherwise, you can type questions into the chat and I can relay those as well if you're not in a position where you can unmute. Okay, Ali, do you want to ask a question?
I do. Hey, Elias.
Hey, Allie.
Hey, you knew I was going to ask a question. I would love to just hear you talk about the timeline of sort of rediscovering your own ancestry and ancestors and this work, and whether one informed the other, or I'm assuming they both informed each other along the way, but whether one was more catalyzing and maybe one more secondary, and just your path through that.
Yes. And it's very on brand of you to ask the first question, girl. So I think when I signed up for Kimmy's class as part of my doctoral coursework, and I went in, like, I had no idea what to expect. I was like, what is this ancestral healing class? I don't even know what this is about. At the time when we started, I didn't think I had the right to claim my Syrian ancestry. I felt like as somebody that walks through the world as this white-bodied male with all the privilege that that comes with, I didn't have the right to claim another part of me. What I learned through doing this work is that's exactly what these events throughout history were trying to do. Through colonization, people were trying to rip us apart of our like rooted ancestry and just replace us with these labels of white, black, brown, and like have us forget that we come from all these other traditions. So like white-bodied people, before they were labeled white, which race was only created in the 17th century, they were Basque or Celtic, or people before they were labeled black, identified as coming from Abyssinia or Dahomey. There are all of these like deep-rooted cultural ties that people have. And it was part of the colonization process that sought to erase those. So when I learned that, I felt actually like claiming these Syrian roots, claiming all these parts of myself is pretty radical. And it's a way to say, okay, this is part of me, this is part of my story. And if I don't name it, if I don't own it, then it's gonna be forgotten. It's gonna be erased. So I think learning that like catalyzed me to want to do this more. And then working with Kimmy, and then now I've been doing this for 4 years. It just kind of gets deeper and deeper as I go on. So I don't know if that's speaking to your question, but.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Hen.
Karen.
Hi, Elias. I know you as Brad because I've heard Kimmy refer to you 1,000 times, always with praise and admiration. And I'm a friend of hers and a former student of hers who also did some of the ancestral work under her guidance. And my question is similar to Allie's about what you learned about your own ancestral traditions and end-of-life practices. So the Syrian line, I'm not sure what your other lineages are. I'd be curious to know. I'm sure you did some research on those as well. You did mention finding an herb that was useful for cleansing and purification, but I imagine you had some other discoveries about your own lineages and their end-of-life practices. So I'd be curious to hear more about that. Thank you.
Thank you. I've heard so much about you too over the years, so it's nice to see you. Okay, I really, to truly, authentically, honestly answer, I haven't had time to look at my own because I've been working with all these other people. So I actually don't know what this, like, the Syrian traditional practices and end of life are, because I've been inundated with this research. What I do know is what you mentioned about the Syrian rue, using that herb to cleanse the space. I also do a lot I listen to a lot of traditional Arab music when I meditate. So those are two ways that I start the process of reconnection. But to be honest with you, I don't know those traditional practices. Put on the to-do list. That's dissertation too, Karen. That'll be post-dissertation, that'll be the book. But thank you.
What about what other lineages are you claiming or have you identified besides the Syrian, or are you 100% Syrian as far as you know?
No, we are mixed European, so German, Irish, we have kind of a smattering of European, and then the Syrian line is my maternal lineage.
Thank you.
Thank you. I wish I had a more impactful answer for you, but that is just the truth.
Eli.
Oh, we have, Jonathan, there's a question in the room.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
That's the microphone.
Hi, I'm Jordana. I'm the communications lead here at the School of Nursing, and Eli and I have really just gotten to know each other pretty recently. And Eli, this is all new information for me, and it's fascinating. So I have kind of a fundamental question, which is in terms of the existential suffering that you discussed at end of life, is the idea that people are not they're not addressing that during life, like it's being repressed and only surfacing at end of life?
Great question. Did y'all hear that in the Zoom land? Okay. So to answer your question, it's a great question. What the research shows is that with soul wounds or intergenerational trauma, when you do the healing, you break the cycle. So the fact that people have not done the work is why it shows up at the end of life. The reason that I'm doing this work with an end-of-life focus is that's because it's my clinical practice, my specialty. But really, the earlier the better that we need to start doing this work. But it is pretty fascinating to show that the research shows that when you do that, you actually heal. The epigenetics also transfer beneficial positive traits. It's not just the harmful or heavy traits. From an indigenous lens, the belief or the knowing is that when you heal, when you break the cycle of trauma and you heal the future, but you also heal the past generations.
Wow.
And the idea, the way it was explained to me by Eduardo Duran, who's an indigenous psychologist that developed the book Healing the Soul Wound, he says, because our ancestors didn't have the tools or the opportunity to do the healing when they were alive, we're kind of tasked with doing the healing for them because they didn't have the opportunity to do it. So I love that idea of blending, again, the Euro-Western epigenetic science with the indigenous. But does that speak to your question?
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
so cool.
start early is the question, is the message. Yeah.
So there's going to be time for a few more questions after, but the committee's returned, and we actually have, to start with, we have a question for Gladys, if you're here. And the committee is wondering, Gladys, do you think he passed? What's your opinion?
Good luck with the IT over there, Craig. I don't know how long this is going to take for them to sort this out. My dad, Uncle Joe, anybody?
Do you think they know how to use it?
They had struggle with the Bluetooth, Craig. I don't know about that.
Okay. Well, we're gonna, then in that case, we can make an intuitive assumption and just welcome her here again, since she's in the room with all of us. And at this time, it's my happy honor to be able to call you Dr. Snyder. You passed your dissertation defense. Very well done. Excellent work.
Beautiful. My heart is full.
Thank you. I'm sweating again. Thank you.
And we have no additions either, so you're free from that. No, we had nothing to suggest that you add, so you're good. So my last assignment for you though is that you go celebrate, and I assume you're planning on doing that.
We're on it. We're on it.
Very good.
Thank you.
Well, while we're all here, if anybody else wants to just unmute and say congratulations, feel free to do that, everybody.
Congratulations.
There it is. That's her.
Congrats.
Congrats.
Cheers. Go have a drink now.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Angel.
So proud of you.
Thank you.
Bravo, bravo.
Thank you. Hey, K-Bay.
Congratulations, Brad.
Thank you.